Welcome to the first episode of the Denison Forum podcast. We're launching this new podcast with a 5-part series centering on Dr. Jim Denison's new book, The Coming Tsunami, and the cultural earthquakes and resulting tidal waves that may pose the gravest threat Christians in America have ever faced. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director at Denison Forum. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Denison to discuss the background and inspiration that led him to write this critical message. Our goal is to help followers of Jesus face the future with courage and confidence. You're listening to episode 1 of the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum. I'm here with Dr. Jim Denison, Chief Vision Officer of Denison Forum. Jim, how are you?
I'm doing well today, Mark. How are you, sir?
Great. Glad to have this conversation with you. Looking forward to where this podcast might go. A little bit of a new experience from me after being a local church pastor for almost 35 years. And so this is a new adventure for me. So looking forward to how this is going to work out. But we're starting today a mini-series of 5 episodes covering and based upon the book that you've recently written that's going to come out in January called The Coming Tsunami. If you're listening to this podcast and want to pre-order the book, you can do that at thecomingtsunami.com, and we hope that you'll check that out. And if you do, there'll be an opportunity for you to be a part of a special presentation in late January about the book where you can be a participant in that. But Jim, just want to kind of take this book and even back the train up a little bit and talk about where this book came from in terms of your prayer life, your thinking. I've read and listened to you talk about a number of issues, some of which are in this book and some things that are new. So I have a sense that this has been deeply ingrained in your soul for a very long time. But for our listeners, help us to understand, how is this book really an outgrowth of your faith, your sense of calling, and even the founding of Denison Forum itself? How is it rooted in that?
Well, thank you, Mark. That's a perceptive question, actually. It really is. So I do need to do a little history, I think, to come back and kind of get a running start at this. For those that might not know my story, my father actually is my story in so many ways. Dad grew up in a small town in Kansas, very, very active in his church. In fact, we found out many years later that he had friends there that thought he might go into vocational ministry because he was so connected to what was happening in this little Methodist church in Kingman, Kansas. And then Second World War came along. Dad volunteered for the Army, was made a radio operator on an island in the South Pacific. 300 men stationed on the island. Only 17 survived the experience. It was so horrific for Dad that he was never able to find his way back to church.
Right.
I don't know that we would say that he had no faith before, would have lost on some level. What faith? That'd be a whole nother conversation. I don't think that. I believe my father's in heaven today. He died when I was in college. But he could never make his faith work with what he experienced there, with evil and suffering that he saw personally. And so I grew up in this loving, wonderful home, but no spiritual life and all my father's questions. If there's a God, why is there war? Science and faith, evil and suffering, all that. Long story short, my brother and I were invited by a bus ministry of a local Baptist church in Houston, Texas, to ride the bus to their church back in 1973. That's where I heard the gospel. Eventually came to faith in Christ, but still had all these questions, all these intellectual, cultural issues. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis was actually game-changing for me. The first time I'd seen anyone deal with faith intellectually. I still have my copy of it that I got in high school out there on the shelf. And it was from that to this that I've been fascinated by cultural and intellectual issues. So when God began calling me into ministry, it was toward that kind of a direction. Wound up doing a PhD in philosophy, teaching philosophy at 4 seminaries and pastoring churches over the years, starting this ministry in 2009. But the narrative behind all that was really my dad in so many ways, reaching people like Dad, people that have intellectual, cultural issues, places where we could help them to think biblically about the issues of the day, and equip Christians to do the same thing. So that's been in a larger kind of a narrative sense what I've been doing for many, many years, many decades of my life. But I will tell you, I could take you to the place in my neighborhood where I was walking one morning, maybe 2 to 3 years ago, and I was making a turn around one particular block, and Mark, it became remarkably, tangibly clear to me. I sensed the Holy Spirit speaking to me about the urgency of the cultural moment, where we are and where we're going. An overwhelming sense that there is a coming rising tide of opposition to biblical morality, to biblical faith, to biblical witness in America, unprecedented in American history. I began sensing that 2 or 3 years ago, that we were moving into that moment, that we're moving into that cultural kind of chapter, as it were. Not claiming persecution like you'd see in North Korea, of course, or in China, or some of the Muslim world, but a sense of opposition to biblical, basic, orthodox Christian belief and practice in the public square.
And I've heard you say that you've talked about that we're really particularly talking about in America, in perhaps if you were to include Western Europe, but we're not. What that moment has been for you has really been focused on that this is unique in the West. This is unique in the United States because of our history, where we've had a great opportunity to exercise faith with religious liberty and to not be fearful of the kinds of persecution and oppression that you mentioned that go on in China and other parts of the world, that this kind of catalyzed, this message of this book kind of catalyzed around the sense of this is unique for our part of the world and for what we have known as Christians and as churches in this part of the world.
That's exactly right. And that's a clarification we need to keep making here, I think. I've been to Beijing. I've met with underground church pastors in China. I've been to Cuba 10 times. I've worked in Bangladesh. I lived in the Muslim world when I was in college. I would never compare this to that, but I would also say that what we're facing, I think, in America and in the West is unprecedented from a philosophical perspective as well, from a cultural perspective as well. A lot of what we're facing is different from what they're facing in North Korea or China or some of the Muslim world. There's a rising worldview challenge. There's a rising ideological belief that essential orthodox biblical doctrine is on the merits dangerous, is on the merits discriminatory, on the merits not just outdated, not just irrelevant, not just oppositional politically, but is dangerous to flourishing for individuals. There's that sense that when I was on that walk that morning, I just began to feel inside of me. So I began unpacking that with those of us in this ministry, with our leaders, with our board, with key donors. And that really, over the last 2 or 3 years, has changed pretty much everything we do here. We've reorganized as a ministry to try to grow as quickly, as broadly as we could, our impact, our influence, to equip as many Christians as possible for this purpose. We've identified 27 million as the evangelical population in America based on some data, some surveys. A tipping point's typically 25%. So we wanted to get to 6.6 million people that we were influencing every month with biblical truth, and we've done that now as a ministry, in the belief that we have to get there because of the urgency that's in front of us. And so that was really 2 or 3 years ago. The first answer to your question was this kind of growing sense of urgency inside me. And then in recent months, kind of a second chapter, a second answer to your question, building on the first, some of the clarity around what actually the threat is began surfacing for me. I began seeing more specifically what the actual issues themselves are and how they feed each other, how they grow each other, some of which are obvious to us, some of which not so much yet in the culture. But I began putting names and faces to issues. I began identifying the specific issues that are behind this larger opposition that I've been fearing and facing for some time. And that was really what led to the book and to this conversation today.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things we'll get to probably in our next episode is the combination of these upheavals or earthquakes that we talk about. We'll get to the metaphor of tsunami in a moment. But I've heard you talk at least about the first two quite a bit over the last few years. But the other two earthquakes that we'll get to relative to things like critical theory and a secular ideology or a secular replacement religion are really kind of the waves of those just now starting to show up and to make impacts that are really affecting the everyday believers' lives. But it really is kind of catalyzed, I think, in my experience of Denison Forum, this idea and calling of trying to be like the men of Issachar, who back in David's time understood the times, they understood the culture and the moment and the place in history in a very significant way. And I love the statement. They understood the times and they knew what Israel should do. They became key in terms of how they might help to lead the nation in the things of God at that point. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do. That's at the very heart of what Denison Forum is all about. We talk about the desire to help Christians to be salt and light in the world. One of the books that we've talked about being important, James Davidson Hunter's book, How to Change the World. Tell us a little bit about that, the book, and how that book has influenced your thinking about the role of Christians in our culture today.
Great. I'm glad you brought that up. Skip Ryan was a longtime pastor at Park Cities Presbyterian Church in North Dallas. When I was pastoring at Park Cities Baptist, we were part of an accountability group. There were 3 pastors of us that got together for lunch a couple times a month, prayed for each other every day. Skip's been a dear friend over the years and a real intellectual leader, I think, in the evangelical world. So we were at lunch together more than 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, and he asked me if I'd seen this book by Hunter. I was familiar with Hunter. Hunter, back in the early 90s, 1992 or 3, was the person that coined the phrase culture wars, for instance. Wasn't advocating them, he was just describing them. Teaches sociology at the University of Virginia, turned down Princeton to stay at Virginia, and
wow.
I think is perhaps the leading sociologist in the evangelical world today. And so Skip put me onto this book that at that point had just been published called To Change the World, in which Hunter, I think, proves sociologically how culture changes and how it doesn't change. And reading that book, that magnum opus by Hunter, was absolutely foundational for me, formative for me in terms of what we do here in this ministry, even to this very conversation. So Hunter takes apart how cultures change and how they don't. He demonstrates cultures don't change just by winning elections. Good to win elections.
Right.
We want Christians involved in the political process. I think God's calling more Christians into public service and are answering that call. But Hunter shows that by itself is not enough to significantly change a culture. For instance, divorce rates skyrocketed in the Reagan administration. Gay marriage first became legal under George W. Bush presidency. Not their fault at all, not saying that, it's just not enough to elect Christians. And
it's only a piece of the story.
That's right. And we so often think it is. A good friend of mine ran for mayor of Dallas, and when he was elected, it's like the Christians then kind of retreated back. We elected our guy.
Yeah.
And he told me later that was so discouraging and so disheartening not to have Christians continue forward with him. So that by itself doesn't do it. Hunter demonstrates that building big churches by itself is not enough to change the culture. He is himself a very committed Christian in the PCA, wants there to be big churches, wants there to be evangelism. But his point is that lost people don't go to religious stuff. People that need influencing outside the church don't typically go to the church. You could look at the growth of the megachurch phenomenon under Bill Hybels and Rick Warren, but have they changed the culture?
I heard you talk about that book several years ago and read it, then had to reread it again for a doctoral seminar that I was in a couple of years ago. And I remember him pointing out something of the same thing, that Chuck Colson, for all that the good that he did, former Watergate conspirator, and established Prison Fellowship, and now the Colson Center, and also James Dobson and the advent of Focus on the Family. All of that was good to a point, but not enough.
Not enough. That's his point. Exactly right. And again, lost people don't
tune in to Focus on the Family to get parenting advice or
in
biblical
fact, they may run from
perspective. Right.
And I was a non-Christian long enough to remember what that was like. Even at the age of 15, I wouldn't have cared what the pastor sermon series was, or if he was doing contemporary or traditional worship down there, or what it might be. To me, that was no more relevant for me than if we were having this discussion about Muslims or about Buddhists or about Hindus. If there's a Buddhist temple down the way, I'm not really going to care what they're doing inside their culture, because I won't see that as relevant.
And the same, certainly true of my testimony. I came to Christ at 17, a little bit older than you, but I had no interest in church. I was in church by my parents' instruction first decade of my life, and then as about a 10-year-old kid, it was almost like they flipped a switch and we just stopped going to church. It would take a couple of decades before I was to learn some of the reasons about why they went from being deeply involved in a faith community to not being involved at all. But as a 10-year-old, I was thrilled to not have to put on uncomfortable clothes and go to a stuffy building and watch things that I didn't understand. And when I ended up coming to Christ through the testimony of a couple of friends in high school, I walked into an evangelical church for the first time and listened to an evangelical pastor preach for the first time. And I'm pretty sure up to that point, I might have heard at a maximum 3 minutes of Billy Graham on a television and was still not impressed at that point in my life. Little did I know it would be a relatively short amount of time before I was the guy standing at that pulpit trying to do what my pastor was doing. So, but to your point, I had no interest in these things, was paying no attention to what some would call the Christian subculture, wasn't clued in that there was a different way of looking at life and looking at everything, really.
I understand that. That's where I was, and that's where so many folk outside the church are today. There's the spiritual but not religious movement,
right,
that causes a lot of people to say they not only don't need to be in the church relative to their souls, a very small percentage of non-Christians are afraid of going to hell, depending on the surveys that you'll see, something like 2%,
right,
afraid they might be going to hell. So they're not going to church to escape hell, nor do they think they have to go to church to be spiritual, because they believe they can get spirituality in nature or wherever they want to do that. And so they see the church as outdated and irrelevant. I will tell you, Mark, the clergy abuse scandal has caused irreparable harm, not only obviously, horrifically, horrendously to its victims, but to the witness of the church in the larger
scandals
culture
across,
as well.
we're not just talking about what's going on in the Roman Catholic Church, but
By no
across the
means.
Protestant groups as well.
Absolutely.
Wide sweeping.
That's right. Absolutely. And is, again, undermining any relevance of the church to the larger culture. And so back to Hunter's point is you can grow these large churches, which is terrific to do, but don't think you're changing the culture just by doing that. So then he comes along to ask, well, how does culture change? And really kind of compress a pretty complex argument. At the end of the day, you achieve your highest place of influence and live there faithfully. He calls it manifesting faithful presence. And if you will do that, your influence, your visibility will make an impact on the culture that you can see and you probably can't see. In fact, in the book, he'll say it may take generations ultimately to see the outworking of the cultural influence of somebody doing what he's describing. And in the book, he makes it clear this can be for good or for bad. You could make the argument, for instance, to digress just a little bit, that back 30 years ago when a group of folk got together to try to legalize same-sex marriage and started with normalizing through the media and through popular culture, and then ultimately to legalize and now to criminalize those that would oppose, that they were following exactly what Hunter was saying. They were getting to places of influence in the culture. They were using that influence to accomplish their agenda. So whether it's for good or for bad, he thinks sociologically that's ultimately how culture changes. You achieve your highest place of influence, live there faithfully. He would call that, again, manifesting faithful presence. It's being salt like Christians. And that's what this ministry exists to do, is to equip people and empower people, to encourage people to live with excellence in their influence and use that influence for Jesus, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. However, God's calling you to do that. And the Coming Tsunami seeks to unmask the opposition that we're facing so we could use our influence more effectively in the cultural assignment God's given us.
So let me take this conversation a little bit differently based on some things we talked about recently. When you start talking, we talk around here a lot about this phrase that's meaningful to us, building a movement of culture-changing Christians. When you think about, well, if you came to your last day and you ask yourself, did I really do what God asked me to do? Did it really make a difference? When you think about seeing change in the culture, how do you think about that? How would you measure that? I mean, what would give you encouragement that we actually are, as Christians, living our lives in manifesting faithful presence in every sphere of influence that we can, and it really is redeeming the culture?
It's a terrific question.
How would you gain some sense of maybe it really is happening and God did use us to bring about an awakening or a new movement of God in our generation?
I think there's good answers to the question and bad answers to the question. The wrong answer to the question is to do this by measuring church attendance the way we've historically done that. That more people showing up on Sundays in denominations that measure such things is the outcome and the evidence of such. If that's the case, it's clearly not working, especially in the mainline denominations where you're seeing such decline today across the board. But as Glenn Stanton and other people have proven in his book, The Myth of the Dying Church, if you're looking for growth in ways that aren't measurable in those old traditional models, then there's a good answer to your question. If you're seeing on college campuses an explosion of interest, as you're seeing right now, in on-campus Christian expression, whether it's Bible studies on campus, worship services on campus, and interest in the Orthodox Church, in college campuses, more college students interested in historicity and rootedness and tradition and liturgy and all that is inside that explosion that we're seeing right now. Youth for Christ is seeing enormous growth. Cru used to be Campus Crusade for Christ, seeing enormous growth, just not in ways that you would traditionally measure. So if we're looking for measurability, we're going to look for places where it could be almost indigenous to the culture, where you're seeing things happening in ways that are a movement more than they are an institutional expression. And we're seeing that right now. We're seeing that in some ways that are very exciting. And the younger people are, the more we're tending to see that to be the case. A second place that you'd be looking is, are we seeing more believers using their influence in what you would think of as a pretty bold or courageous way in the larger culture? And we're seeing that as well. For instance, I get to work with the CEO Forum, which is a gathering of CEOs in very large corporations. They have to be in very large corporations to be qualified to be in this group, all of whom are evangelical Christians. I've gotten to be at some of their retreats recently, speaking in some of their space recently, and I am so encouraged by the degree to which these men and women are using their platform internally and externally to stand for biblical truth in redemptive ways. And I can't give examples without betraying some confidences, but in some of these rooms where these men are talking with each other, sharing with each other, the stories they're telling, the price they're paying, the degree to which they're willing to stand for biblical morality in their space leaves me in awe of the risks they're taking and the courage that they're manifesting.
So whether they've read Hunter's book or not, there are some people that are intuitively or intentionally being drawn into this idea that Hunter has of allowing yourself, seeking the highest place of influence and living and manifesting faithful presence there. CEO Forum is an expression of some people that are doing that.
Doing exactly that, precisely so. On a third level would be the number of Christians that are running for public service right now, that are engaging in public office, who are very committed, what we would think of as evangelical, conservative, born-again Christians, and who are doing so as a means to the end of glorifying God, not to do a theocracy, not to try to bring about some sort of church-dominated state, but really trying to use their influence effectively for Christ. I will pick an example of this at the risk of sounding partisan. We're a nonpartisan ministry. This is not an endorsement on any level. It's just an example. Glenn Youngkin's recent election as governor in Virginia is an example of this. He is a member of CEO Forum. He is a person that has donated something like $40 million of his personal wealth to the common good, to meeting need, some of it in Christian context, some of it in less, what we would identify in that way. And as somebody who really felt he was called into this space as a Christ follower, to do this to honor Jesus. So that's not an endorsement of a party or of an individual, but it's an example of people that God seems to be moving in, to be calling them into this sort of public service at a time when it's very difficult to do that, when it's been more difficult to be in public service than maybe it's ever been. I'm seeing some of that, which is really encouraging to me. A fourth answer to the question very quickly would be the degree to which we're around pastors, and you're seeing this as well, who are seeing themselves less institutionally and more culturally than ever before. That are wanting to get their church out into society. They're wanting to measure success, not by who comes, but by what they do because they came. I think COVID had a lot to do with that.
Right.
Realizing that we can do church without the walls.
Getting beyond the walls.
Yeah, exactly. We can meet felt need in ways that digital technology provides that we couldn't before. We're seeing people that are trying to find new kingdom visions for how to work outside denominations necessarily and work in partnerships in ways that are exciting.
Yeah, there seems to be definitely some movement across traditional denominational lines. It almost feels like the believers and the pastors that I'm talking to, that we're all sensing this tsunami that you talk about. We're going to get to a little bit more specifically in a moment, but it's almost like any friend in the foxhole.
Right.
It seems to be growing, not to the point of putting down all distinctives and all understandings of theology and faith, but looking beyond some of the territorialism that we've had into this idea of, hey, if there is, as we sense in some ways, a growing sense of opposition to fundamental evangelical Christian belief and practice, then we're going to need each other. And we need to certainly get beyond, and should have always been trying to get beyond, but especially now, the pettiness that sometimes keeps us apart from each other. And there seems to be the linking of more partnerships that weren't always there before.
Absolutely, which is answering Jesus' prayer in John 17, that we
Right.
would be one so the world will believe the Father sent the Son. That's one of the ways I think God is redeeming this cultural moment, is to make us realize we need each other on a different level. And then a fifth answer to the question that we can measure anyway is the degree to which people are accessing spiritual resources in unprecedented ways. YouVersion, that recently passed 500 million downloads. The growth of our ministry during the pandemic, when we essentially doubled in terms of our reach as people were seeking digital resources with spiritual content, spiritual truth for the crisis like this. Again, I think God's redeeming the pandemic in that way. We're seeing a fascination right now with spiritual resources in a way that really is outside the tradition again. It's not necessarily going to a Christian bookstore as much as it is finding resources that's available to you, whether it's YouTube videos, where it's podcasts like this, where people are really, I think, experiencing what St. Augustine said when he said our hearts are restless till they rest in him. Pascal said we have a God-shaped emptiness in us. And now the Lord is using this moment for all the downsides of digital technology. He's using this, I think, to speak to that hunger in the heart. And there's a lot of analytical evidence that God's redeeming this in that way, and it's very exciting.
So there's a lot of reason to be encouraged here, even though we're going to spend some time as we talk about the things that you point to in this book. We're going to talk about a lot of the darkness and some of the things that are very troubling and that we need to be concerned about and that we need to be prepared for. There's also a whole lot of signs of hope. We have to think about that differently. We have to broaden our understanding in this idea about the Holy Spirit, that, as Jesus said, he blows where he wishes.
Right.
You sense the movement of the Spirit. You sense the movement like you do the wind, but you can't control the wind, and you can't control all the places where he may be moving and active in this world. And we don't want to get to the point where we just call anything a movement of the Spirit, because that wouldn't be legitimate. But as you said, we can't just measure it by the sometimes overly simplistic ways of, how many churches do we have? How many people came to church? How many people did we baptize? Those things are always valuable to a certain extent, but really never told us the whole story anyway.
And that's what God's doing now, is
Right.
really outside that in remarkable ways. Quick example of what God's doing in the Muslim world. That's another example of this. More Muslims come into Christ in the last 15 years than the previous 15 centuries. And most of them, many of them, through visions and dreams of Jesus. Muslims believe very much in dreams and visions. They believe that's how God gave the Quran to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, is through visions and dreams. And now Isa, as he's known in Arabic, is appearing to Muslims, apparently by the millions, around the world in a white robe. And they're responding to this vision, and they're wanting to know more about this. Mark, there's actually a group in Egypt that took out billboards. And the billboards said, if you've seen the man in a white robe, call this number.
Wow.
And Muslims are calling that number and are coming to faith in Christ. Last week, I had a discussion with a dear friend of mine who founded a ministry in Bangladesh that earns the right to share the gospel by doing microloans, by doing fish farms, by doing absolute, obvious, relevant ministry to the needs of the day. He shared with me last week they've seen more than 10,000 Muslims come to Christ just in the last 2 years.
Wow, it sounds astounding to us as American Christians. We're totally unaccustomed, for the most part, to that kind of movement of the Spirit. We need to sometimes go back and reread the book of Acts, because God's not limited to the more rational, what you might call rational, logical way that we tend to think about faith, and that you have to come to Christ through this very mental, logical kind of way. We might consider that to be strange in most ways, that people would be called to faith through visions and dreams and that type of thing. That's just not a part of our world, but it's still an indication that God is very much at work, and kind of comes back around to what you said earlier, that what's going on, whether it's the clergy abuse scandals or other things, it's almost like perhaps the devil decided he had to come up with a particular strategy for the church in the West, the church in America, so as to try to discredit the gospel, to try to discredit Christ. And that's a lot of what this book is about.
Absolutely.
This is about exposing and identifying that particular strategy that the devil is trying to orchestrate in our culture.
I think that's exactly right.
Postmodernism, the sexual revolution, critical theory, secularism, These are the 4 cultural quakes that have shifted the ground beneath our feet, the issues that have caused many to label Christians as intolerant and even dangerous. Separately, they are hot-button issues. Together, they've launched the coming tsunami that threatens to silence and submerge Christians in America today. But what can stop a tsunami? In The Coming Tsunami, Why Christians Are Labeled Intolerant, Irrelevant, Oppressive, and Dangerous, and How We Can Turn the Tide, pastor and cultural scholar Dr. Jim Dennison of the Dennison Forum identifies the enormous danger these cultural quakes represent. He then offers proactive, biblical steps to turn the tide before it's too late. But Christians must act now. The rain has already started to fall. Pre-order your copy today at thecomingtsunami.com. And know that when you pre-order, you'll also be invited to our online book launch event on January 25th.
A dear friend of mine who spent his life in the Middle East as a missionary would tell you that the rise of radical Islam at exactly the same time that the spiritual awakening began in the Muslim world is not a coincidence. The radical Islam is Satan's attempt to get the West to be frightened of Muslims at the very time we should be loving them and reject them at the time we should be praying for them and join them in this movement. And that was Satan's response to that. In our culture, it's kind of the opposite of that. C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letter says Satan has 2 strategies. One is to make you think he's more powerful than he is, and you'll be scared of him. The other is to make you believe he doesn't exist.
Right.
I think he's doing that in our culture. And what's happening here is we're seeing a rising opposition to biblical truth in a way that's become so persuasive for so many millions of people as to make the gospel out of bounds, as to make biblical morality dangerous to society. And he's doing it in a way that is so culturally aligned with where we've been over these last several decades that it just becomes conventional wisdom to the average person you're speaking to. I get around people quite often in the academy, and it's just astounding to me from when I started doing this 40 years ago to where I am right now, how much it's just conventional wisdom that if you're a scientist, you can't be a Christian. That in my case, if you're a philosopher, you can't be a Christian. That if you're really a thinker, that you can't be a Christian, because everybody knows that Christians are homophobic, bigoted, prejudiced, narrow-minded, discriminatory, that they're tied to myths of the past, that they're superstitious, that we're as antithetical to the progress of history as if you and I were defending the gods of Mount Olympus, that we're seen in exactly that way. When Richard Dawkins says religion is a virus in the software of humanity that must be expunged, he's not speaking prophetic, predictive truth. He's describing reality for the people that live where he lives.
And back that up a little bit, there may be some, perhaps many, I don't know, who don't have a real frame of reference for who people like Richard Dawkins is. But trace that out for just a little bit in terms of who is Richard Dawkins and who does he represent in terms? There's actually a significant group of thinkers and scientists that would kind of fit in this bucket around Richard Dawkins, and how they have actually risen, kind of like you were talking about in the Muslim world relative to radical Islam, how they have kind of in the last few decades really mobilized and become aggressive, militant, people like Peter Singer. Talk about that a little bit, about how that has kind of coalesced together in this pivotal moment that we're sensing.
Great. I'm so glad you brought that up. Richard Dawkins is a British biologist, a scientist, evolutionary biologist by trade. That's his background. He's not a theologian. He's not a philosopher, something he needs to be reminded of pretty often because he gets into this space. Right. So his massive book that has really been formative for so many is called The God Delusion. And it essentially makes this argument that religion in general is dangerous to society. That religion, regardless of what specific god or gods we have in mind here, focuses on heaven instead of earth. It focuses on buildings instead of people. We now know it causes 9/11s. It causes clergy abuse scandals. We know that religion as a category is outdated, irrelevant, and dangerous to the future of society. That human flourishing requires the kind of personal authenticity that religion is the enemy of. That's been Dawkins' claim. He's made it on pseudoscientific grounds over the years. He's made it by trying to expose what he believes are the errors of Christianity in particular and Judeo-Christian movement largely. And he's become in many ways the face of what's called the angry atheist movement that you're describing. Christopher Hitchens, very much part of this. Daniel Dennett, part of this. Peter Singer, Sam Harris, a number of people who are brilliant communicators. I mean, Richard Dawkins is a brilliant writer, a brilliant communicator. Christopher Hitchens, actually got to debate with him once, and might come back to that at some point. An absolutely brilliant writer. I mean, a genius as a wordsmith, as a creator. Sam Harris, a brilliant communicator. These were some of the first people to maximize digital platforms, to be putting up podcasts and YouTube videos and such back in the space. And so they really captured the attention of a generation of people that want themselves to be committed to intellectual life, that want to be part of the academy in some way, and they've given them the ability to, in some way, find warrant and justification for rejecting a gospel they didn't want to believe anyway.
And in would you say in some ways they kind of got out of their lane, or sometimes do get out of their lane?
All of them. None of them trained theologians.
Right.
None of them trained philosophers.
Right.
When Christopher Hitchens' book came out some years ago, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, I wrote a review of it for our website and made it part of my book on wrestling with God that was coming out at that same period of time. I have a whole appendix in the back of my book, Wrestling with God, exposing the dozens of mistakes Hitchens makes in the book just on the merits. Things that a first-year seminary student or even college religion student would know he's wrong about. Not just miscitation of Scripture, not just getting facts of history wrong, but just basic, simple religious dogma that he's misrepresenting, that he's misquoting, that he's mischaracterizing in ways that either he doesn't understand or he's being pretty manipulative about. I have a whole appendix just exposing all of that. And so none of these folk have any professional expertise in this space. It'd be as though I were to come into Richard Dawkins' world and try to take on evolution as though I were somehow a biologist myself.
Yeah, from a biology standpoint.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So first thing he would say is, you're not a biologist, you have no standing in this conversation.
Right.
Yet he thinks he has standing.
In theology and
Exactly.
philosophy.
That's right. That's been a lot of the challenge.
And what we've seen is a healthy response in some way, what I would call a hopeful response with people like you and the Denison Forum, other people that I've recently been exposed to over the last number of years, people like John Lennox, who has the ability to stand into these conversations and talk about things such as, you're kind of out of bounds in terms of the merits, and to be a response to this, but it's not really always the case, but sometimes it feels like the case that the Christian community, the evangelical community, is always in a response mode, catching up. It's not always the case. It just sometimes feels like that more than it should. But let's take a few minutes. All of that is fabulous background, in my opinion, to where this book and the message of this book, more importantly, comes from in terms of your thinking, in terms of your heart. But let's just stop for a minute. We live in Texas. We don't live on the coast. The closer we get to that were our trips to Galveston when we were kids, down on the Texas coast. Why the metaphor tsunami? Tell us where that comes from and why that is what this book is named.
Well, you're right. Down in Galveston, we don't see a lot of tsunami warning signs, do we?
Only when there's a good hurricane coming in.
Yeah, exactly. So I was in Hawaii not too long ago, got to go over there on miles, frequent flyer miles and all that stuff. And in Hawaii, you see these signs everywhere as you get close to the coast. Tsunami warning signs and pathways. And when tsunamis are coming, here's where the shelter is, and this is what you need to do and all that sort of thing. So a tsunami, as folk might or might not know, is typically a very large tidal wave. You would think.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we just called them tidal waves.
Yeah, exactly. Same kind of idea. They're typically found around what's called the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Rim, as it were. One example would be back on March 11, 2001. There was an earthquake underwater 45 miles off the coast of Japan that caused a tsunami that killed nearly 16,000 people, destroyed 120,000 structures. Massive tidal wave. Well, the tidal wave you see is caused by forces you typically don't.
Right.
Tsunamis can be caused by meteors, they can be caused by mudslides, but 80% of the time they're caused by offshore earthquakes. In the case of Japan, 45 miles offshore. An earthquake you didn't see. An earthquake that was so far away that unless you had a Richter scale or some way of measuring tremor, you wouldn't even know it existed. It didn't topple any buildings where you are. It didn't upend any highways, didn't do what earthquakes do when they're land-based. It's not like the San Andreas Fault sort of a thing. You don't see that earthquake out there, that underwater earthquake, but it causes It's the catalyst of the tidal wave that you do see. And so to use this metaphor, I believe that this tsunami that we're in the early stages of, this cultural rising opposition, has been caused by underwater earthquakes, some of which we're more familiar with than others, but that which over the last 30 or 40 years have been combining their forces in a way that are creating the moment that we find ourselves in today.
And so, a little bit of or maybe a lot of the panic that we feel as Christians and as churches, particularly in our culture, is really about the waves that we've started to experience. But the book takes us back to where the quakes are. And we'll get into this perhaps in our next episode, that some of these quakes have actually been starting quite a long time ago, can be measured by decades, if not by centuries, right?
That's right, correctly so.
That we need to look that far back.
And that's, again, one of the things that I've hoped to be able to do in terms of providing a larger service through the book and through the ministry that we do here. C.S. Lewis, again, in his Mere Christianity, explains that he came into what's known as apologetics, methods of defending the faith, because, as he said, that was the place in the line, thinking in military terms, where the line was the weakest and the place to which he felt most naturally inclined. And so to it, I naturally went, he said. Well, as I've said, I've always had a natural kind of bent toward ideas, cultural meta-narratives, kind of trying to connect the dots anyway, trying to explain why we are where we are. Philosophers like me are always fascinated by the whys, just to begin with. And so even back when I was teaching philosophy in seminary, starting back in the 1980s, I was dealing with a lot of these issues we're talking about right now. But what I felt like I maybe could do is explain some of this in terms that would be maybe more translatable to folk that don't have that background, that haven't spent their life studying philosophy and Western culture per se, but also explain why it's happening and why it's so relevant today. And so to your point, the first earthquake that we can talk about further down the way is a denial of biblical truth. Well, for that, academically, you go all the way back to Immanuel Kant. And really prior to Kant, to kind of catch that stream, that's 2 or 3 centuries ago.
Right,
and if you get to this place,
and if you weren't trained as a philosopher or theologian, you may not even know who Immanuel Kant is.
Exactly,
right?
Much less Descartes and the Reformation prior to that, and all that goes into that.
So before we get into those in our next episode, tell us why it is important that we understand the roots of this, and then I have a follow-up question that I'd like you to respond to, which is this in significant measure, or even the major reason, is that the church failed in its witness and ministry? Is that in part the answer to how these earthquakes started that resulted in these tsunami waves of cultural impact that we're dealing with and that you talk about in the book?
Oh, I think there's absolute truth in that, unfortunately, tragically. I would say that's categorically true. My friend John Stonestreet, that now leads the Colson Center, has a statement that I've quoted quite often. Good ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims.
Powerful statement, by the way.
And so, understanding the bad ideas out there is just as important as the good ideas, right? Understanding the virus that's causing this pandemic is critical to ending the pandemic.
Right.
And so it is that we have to go back and unearth why we got to where we are in order to better understand where we're going and what we can do about it. Abraham Lincoln said, if we could better understand whence we've been, we could understand where we are and where we're going. And it's that kind of an idea. So that's part of why unearthing these ideas and explaining their relevance today is critical to not only understanding the present, but predicting the future and being able to respond redemptively. In terms of the church's role in all of this, I think far more not knowing than knowing, far less intentional than not, it has been true that the church has in many ways not been the salt and light that we needed to be in the culture over these decades. And even going back these centuries, you could say as well. If the church had been more effective in communicating the actual essential gospel truth to the culture, I don't think there would have been nearly as much bandwidth, as much oxygen in the room for a lot of what we're seeing right now. Not just the things of recent decades, but even going back to some of the philosophy behind a lot of what we're talking about. One quick example, I mentioned Immanuel Kant, University of Königsberg in Germany. We're in the early 1700s here. Now, as we're talking about late 1600s, early 1700s, the church of the day, as he understood it, was so staid, was so formal, was so irrelevant to everyday life, at least as Kant would say he experienced it, that he himself was in no sense part of it. Found it in no sense to be relevant to his life or satisfying to him intellectually. There's a story about how the faculty at the University of Königsberg would line up to go into chapel. And Kant would join them, walk all the way up to the door, get to the door, and then turn and go back home a different way. In his mind, the church was just not relevant to him intellectually or personally. Didn't mean that he didn't believe in God per se. In fact, he had a moral argument for God's existence that is still debated and used on some levels today, but as a category. But he found in the church no relevance that spoke to his heart.
And was probably carrying around a lot of these same kind of very deep, very important, very significant questions about all kinds of things dealing with faith, and wasn't finding meaningful answers. We talk about a lot around here about what it means to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Perhaps that's the unique niche of Denison Forum, is to try to help believers to be equipped to think well about faith and to answer some of these questions, whether they're old questions or new questions. But maybe that was somewhat lacking in his day and in the decades and centuries that followed.
I would say that would be true. If you move to the second earthquake that we'll talk about, which is a denial of biblical morality, now you're back in the 50s and 60s. And you're at a time when you're seeing cataclysmic things happening in the culture, whether it's Vietnam or it's Woodstock, it's Watergate, it's all the things happening at that era. And there was just so many people anyway that rightly or wrongly felt the church was on the sidelines of all of that the church wasn't speaking into the issues, that the church and the clergy and the institutions and denominations weren't finding ways to build bridges over to new generations of college students and young adults, and rather were dismissive of them, were more rejecting of the hippie generation, as it was called, than they were trying to find ways to build into them. Now, there certainly are exceptions to that, and we're grateful for that. There were the Jesus people, as you recall, in the 60s, and some movements that are still going today that came out of some of that. Calvary Chapel in California, other things. So that's certainly by no means across the board true, nor is it true that whether it's Immanuel Kant or those rejecting biblical morality in the 60s, that they didn't have their own agendas they brought to the bear as well. In many ways, this just justified kind of what they wanted to believe anyway, I think. But I also think it's unfairly true to say that the church wasn't at that point, if you're thinking in America anyway, trying to be as bridge building, trying to be as indigenous, trying to be as entrepreneurial in reaching out to the larger culture as these massive changes are occurring. And it, in some ways, is an instructive lesson for us in this moment. How do we make certain that we're being as incarnational, as initiatory as we need to be as we reach out into this generation as well?
And so the book really, as we kind of maybe start to move toward closing up today, is really a clarion call to action. But it really is centered in this call to action to be the best salt and light you can be, to do what the Bible teaches us to do, to be in the world but not of the world, to live our lives in such a way that our lives reflect toward Christ and point people in His direction. And the book is really starts off defining realities. That's kind of the first job of every leader, is to try to define reality so people understand where they are. And that's the first part of the book relative to these 4 earthquakes that we'll talk about in our next section, that we're living in a post-truth culture. We're living in a post-biblical morality culture, that we're seeing the rise of things like critical theory, which is a very interesting topic for a lot of people right now. And then this wraparound idea of secular ideology, secular religion, if you will, and what comes from those things individually and collectively in terms of tidal waves of consequences. And then we'll finish up in the book talking about redemptive strategies that believers need to embrace, that, in my opinion, kind of is in the spirit of 1 Peter, particularly 1 Peter chapter 4, where he talks about, don't be surprised about the fiery trials that you're experiencing, that we're probably in some of that, maybe in more of it. And one of the interesting things I've heard you say about this book and the message of this book is that you hope you're wrong in some ways. Finish up with that statement. Why do you hope that what you're pointing out in this book, you hope that you're wrong about in a lot of ways? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, one's on a very personal level. I heard a pastor years ago say, beware of people who preached on hell as though they liked it. You know? They say you should never preach on hell without a tear in your eye. And so we certainly, if we love our Lord and we love our neighbor, don't want this to be the case. We don't want what we're seeing now and are going to see coming down the way to happen, because so many millions of lives are being devastated as a result. And we don't want this to be true, even in the present context, much less as it will get worse, I'm afraid, if things continue down this way. But there's also a sense in which it's always too soon to give up on God. Actual tsunamis can't be reversed. Right. I actually saw, Mark, not too long ago, somebody that thought Maybe he had come across a way of creating some sound waves, underwater sound waves, that once the underwater earthquake had occurred could perhaps be sounded in front of that earthquake and could stop the tsunami before it gets built, but that was never tested. It was never experimented out, and so it was just purely a theory. So to my knowledge, there's no way physically to stop a tsunami once it's actually started. Spiritually, that's not true. Spiritually, it's always too soon to give up on God. Spiritually, we can still be part of a Holy Spirit-inspired, transformative spiritual awakening. In fact, I would say there have been 4 great awakenings in American history: 1734, 1792, 1858, 1904, and 5. Every one was preceded by desperation. If one thing God could do in this, one way God would redeem this, is to cause the church to be more desperately praying, more desperately sacrificing, courageously in their witness and their influence, more desperately engaging the culture than we would be otherwise, then that'll be a good thing. It's too soon to believe that God can't reverse this tsunami and that we can't see a better future than will be the case otherwise. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what we want all of us that we can influence to join us in being, is a movement of Christians who will use our influence redemptively, proactively, courageously, knowing that salt and light always works way out of its volume. It takes a very little bit of salt to shape all the food you're eating, takes a very little bit of light to defeat the dark. Well, that's the good news of God's goodness and his grace.
Yeah, that's the economy of God in a good word, because every believer has this same choice every single day. When faced with desperation, you can either become dependent upon God through prayer and other means that he's given us, or we become despondent. We face that challenge and that opportunity every single day.
That's right.
Well, Jim, thank you for being a part of this first podcast relative to tsunami and what this book is all about. We want to invite our listeners to continue this journey with us. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking about these 4 earthquakes of culture, and particularly what it means to be in a post-truth culture. That's coming up on our next episode. If you've been challenged or inspired by what you've heard today, as we have talked about the background of the Coming Tsunami book, we hope you'll share this with a friend. We're grateful that you're a part of the Denison Forum ministry. We hope you'll like this on Apple Podcasts, and we look forward to having you a part of future conversations. Have a great day. On our next episode of the Denison Forum podcast.
When I teach the history of Western thought, I will say to the students, it's Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, and everything else is a footnote.
Wow.
So this Kantian idea that truth is how your mind interprets your senses, so by definition, therefore, there can be no such thing as absolute truth, is different. That's what wasn't happening with Pilate and Jesus. That wasn't what culture thought before Kant. This absolute denial of the possible existence of truth itself. But Mark, that idea, whether you've ever heard of Immanuel Kant, has now become so pervasive in Western society. It is the air we breathe. It is assumed as an absolute starting point in any intellectual conversation. So it turns the Bible into a diary of religious experience. It's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John experienced, but I have no right to force that on you. It makes the church a purveyor of social programs. It makes Christianity one way up the mountain. Doesn't matter what you believe so long as you're sincere and tolerant. It makes evangelism the unfair imposition of my values on somebody else. It is a denial of objective truth status across the board.